Hi everyone. I welcome you all in the next lecture of the course of cellular microenvironment from oxygen diffusion to gene expression. So in previous lecture, we have understood about what is cellular microenvironment, what are the components of the cellular microenvironment, and we answered also whether the cellular microenvironment is dynamic in nature and what happens if cellular microenvironment changes. So in today's lecture, we are going to understand one of the most important components of the cellular microenvironment, and that is oxygen. And here we will understand how oxygen diffuses in the tissue and how the oxygen gradient arises in the tissue. And we'll also see that if all of these, let's say, metabolites or nutrients is being supplied by the blood vasculatures. So whether, I mean, all of these cells are, getting equal amount of the nutrients or not. And if it is not getting the equal amount of nutrient, we'll find out the reason why it is not getting the equal amount of the nutrients and another metabolite factor. So let's try to understand one thing here. So as I've told you, if every cell in our body is supplied by the blood vasculature, that means then why don't all the cells receive the same amount of oxygen? Or why do some cells experience hypoxia while other receives plenty of oxygen? And to answer that question, let's follow or let's try to understand with the help of oxygen molecules. So if you see here, once the oxygen molecules leaves the blood vessels, uh, you can see uh, because in our body the oxygen molecules are getting transported by the capillary through the blood cells. So on the left side here, you can see that this blue dot shows the oxygen molecules, and this concentration of oxygen inside the blood vasculature will be high. And these red blood vessel, this red blood cells transport oxygen through the body. But oxygen cannot remain inside, the blood vessel. It must leave the blood and diffuse into the surrounding tissue so that the cells can use it. So here you can see that the blue dot represents the oxygen molecule diffusing out of the capillary. Now, let's try to understand this thing. So oxygen moves by diffusion. So diffusion means simply that molecules will move from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. And concentration gradient is the, or change in the concentration, or here I'll tell you only change in the concentration is the driving force for the diffusion. So but does every oxygen molecules travel in the same distance? If you see, because from the capillary, if it diffuse from capillary to tissue, then what about the every molecules? Every molecules will travel the same distance or not? And the answer is no. Why? Because if you see, let's say the first cell is located very close to the blood vessel, and since oxygen has just left the capillary, so the oxygen concentration around this first cell would be very high. So I'm just explaining these things with the help of one day diffusion. The in actual real tissue, you will see the diffusion will happen in 3 dimensions only. So if you are able to understand 1D easily, then definitely you will be able to understand the 3 dimensional problem very easily. So as we have seen that the concentration near this first cell would be high for the oxygen, and as a result, cell one will receive oxygen in abundant amount, and it will perform the normal aerobic metabolism. Now, what happens? However, something important happens as oxygen moves through the tissue. Every cell continuously consumes the oxygen to produce ATP inside the mitochondria. And this is just a biological phenomenon. And the oxygen is not simply, moving, it is also, getting used by the cells. Right. So, and this is the key idea. So as oxygen diffuses farther from the blood vessels, two things are happening simultaneously. One is oxygen has to travel a longer distance from capillary to the tissue side. And then second, the cell along the way continuously consumes the oxygen. Is that clear? So therefore, if you see, the cell 2 receives slightly less oxygen than cell 1, cell 3 receives even less, cell 4 experiences low oxygen, and cell 6, you can see, By the time the oxygen reaches to the cell 6, the concentration has become extremely low, and this condition is called as the hypoxia. Okay. So everything we discussed in this image that can be summarized in this graph. And this graph can tell you these things very easily. So the x-axis represents the distance from the blood vasculatures that I have told you this distance. And y-axis represents the concentration of oxygen in the percentage. So notice that what happens, the oxygen concentration is decreasing continuously as we are moving further away from the blood vasculature. That means x equals to 0. Is that clear? So this graph simply represents that we observe in the cells, that we observe this kind of phenomena in the aortic tissue. So here you can see that the graph slopes downwards because oxygen is continuously diffusing away from the blood vessel while simultaneously it is being consumed by the cell. Not because oxygen disappears magically, it is basically used by the cell. So this phenomena especially become especially important in the cancer because tumor grow very rapidly, and as the tumor becomes very large, many cancer cell becomes farther and farther from the blood vasculature, something like that. And these distant cell receives very little amount of oxygen, and consequently that creates the hypoxic region inside the solid tumor. So here you can see, if we assume this is blood vasculature and this is solid tumor, so from the blood vasculatures, what happens? There is a decrease in the concentration of oxygen for oxygen, nutrients, and energy, and then decrease in drug concentration. Because if you are going away from the vessel blood vasculatures, what will happen due to the diffusion and the consumptions of the oxygen, nutrients, energy, and the drug by the cells? Obviously, the concentration will decrease from if you are going farther away from the cell. And due to this particular diffusion limited condition and consumptions of all these metabolites, solid tumor has been divided into three different zones, where outer zone, which is green color, that is called as the proliferating zone. And this zone is, you can assume this zone is like this zone, which is in the vicinity of blood vasculature, and that will be getting continuous supply of oxygen, nutrients, energy, and the drug. And due to this region, cells will be actively proliferating in this region. That is why it is called as the proliferating zone. Then there comes a quiescent zone, which is the next zone to the proliferating zone, and which is a bit distance from the blood vasculature. So there will be limited diffusion of oxygen, energy, nutrients, something like that. That's why in this region the rate of cell proliferation will be less compared to the outer zone, which was the proliferating zone. And then there comes a third zone, which is a necrotic core, that is also called as the hypoxic core, where there is a very little amount of oxygen concentration or nutrients and the drug concentration, because till it is very far distance from the blood vasculature, and due to this region diffusion limitations and the consumptions by the cells, there will be limited oxygen concentration here. So in this region, cells will try to survive only while activating some survival pathway. And this is how the solid tumor looks like. And this kind of phenomena makes this solid tumor highly heterogeneous. And due to this heterogeneity in the solid tumor, you will observe all of these regions shows behaves very differently. So if any drug is working very well in the proliferating zone, that drug may not work well in this hypoxic or necrotic core, because cells will start showing some kind of resistance towards the environment. And this is where the cellular microenvironment thing comes, because here you can see that the cellular microenvironment in the outer region, that is in the proliferating region, was very different, and the cellular microenvironment in this necrotic core is very different. That's why the cells will behave differently in all of these different regions, right? So that's why now you would have understood about the motivation of understanding the cellular microenvironment and why cellular microenvironment is very important, because ultimately it will lead to the heterogeneous behavior of the cells in different region of the solid tumor, and that will ultimately show some kind of drug resistance. Okay, so with that, I would like to end this lecture here only. So in this lecture, I'll summarize that we understood about how oxygen diffuses inside the tissue. It is also getting consumed by the cells, and due to the diffusion of oxygen, what happens? You'll see there is a decreasing concentration profile of oxygen from blood vasculature to the farther away from the tissue side, and this makes a solid tumor highly heterogeneous, and that ultimately shows some kind of drug resistance. Okay, thank you. I'll stop this lecture here. See you in the next lecture.